So welcome everybody to the Be Better Club. It's good to see you all. My name is Jonathan Beaver. I'm the director of the UCF Center for Ethics and an assistant professor of ethics and digital culture in the Department of Philosophy and in our Text and Technology PhD program here on campus. And with Dr. Kubler, we started these discussion groups, I guess, last semester. It's just a way to give us space to think about ethics together in a way that we normally don't get to. So that's me. Dr. Kubler, do you want to go?
I'm Steve Kubler. Apparently, I don't know who anyone is. Actually, I see Austin, who was formerly in my optics class. He's one of these new people I was expecting. But yeah, these are fun opportunities to take a break from all the work I'm supposedly supposed to be doing and do some things that are very interesting and exciting. So look forward to meeting new people who are here today, and it's good to see familiar faces as well. Who's next?
What are we doing? Introductions?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So I'm Sterling Courtney. I was with Dr. Beaver in the graduate certificate program in theoretical and applied ethics, and I'm now in a master's program at Western Michigan University for spirituality, culture, and health. And I'm probably in the twilight of my career, and I don't know how I'm going to squeeze that into a new career here. I should be 60 when I graduate, but that's where it's at. Yeah. So.
Should we just poke people? Is that the thing to do?
I'll jump in here. I wasn't sure if there was a structured order. Hi, everybody. I'm Sean Hinkle. I am a senior undergraduate student at UCF, majoring in psychology with a minor in computer science. I'm going to finish a couple classes short of a minor in philosophy, so I apologize. I was introduced to this club from Dr. Beaver through an ethics workshop through the HUT program. So this is my first time attending.
Good to have you, Sean. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Can everybody hear me? Okay, perfect. Yes, Dominic Green Sanders. I am a PhD student, actually now a candidate at USF. And so my major is philosophy, or my concentration is philosophy, but it's more so into applied ethics. And so now I'm into the dissertation process.
Joshua, do you want to go?
Yeah, I'll go. So I'm actually a freshman coming up now, and I just saw the club recently through my engineering class, my introduction engineering class, and I'm a photonics major. I know I'm just starting out, but I thought it'd be really interesting to have discussion with y'all, and yeah.
Good to have you. Thanks.
This seems like a good time for me to jump in. Nice to meet you, Josh. I'm Austin. I'm a junior, about to be senior photonics student. I was interested in the club after taking Dr. Kubler's class because I was previously a political science major and I have interest in philosophy. So yeah, that's where I'm at.
Nice meeting you. Good to have somebody else.
I apologize for my lack of video today. I'm kind of forced to join via mobile, and I can't really consistently keep the camera on myself. So.
No, it's good. I'm glad to have you here. Yeah, no worries at all. Allison, do you want to go since you're also visiting?
Yep, happy to go. Hi, I'm Allie Kerr. I have a PhD in industrial organizational psychology and join here because I have a mission to solve ethics, which really just means I like to spend my time in professional development, which absolutely includes ethics. So something like this and how it works is very interesting to me.
Well, and the other thing to add on Allie's behalf is that she and I, with a colleague of ours at Purdue, brainstormed this podcast approach, and we've been applying it. Allie's doing some in her classes, and our colleague Andrew Brightman is doing some in his class, and we're doing podcasts here. So the podcast structure is to sort of figure out, like, what can we do differently with ethics via podcast that we can't do via articles? So it's a fun experiment we're doing together, Ali and I, this semester. Yeah. Lakeland?
Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Lakeland Taylor. I am a second year doctoral student who is interested in looking at risk and crisis communication, but in the contexts of religion and ethics. And I'm very passionate about like ethical communication and things like that. And so one of the tenets of any class that I teach is a module and then preceding questions about ethics throughout all we do. And so this semester, I'm actually teaching a health communication class where we've grappled with ethics and health, right? So I think that I'm really looking forward to this discussion in particular because it's what is occupying my mind right now because of the class that I teach. So, but yeah, that's pretty much it about me. If you have any questions, I'm here for them.
Well, and the other thing to add on Lakeland's behalf is that she and I have worked on now 2 papers, one accepted and one we have a revise and resubmit pending on some bioethics related issues around health communication. So that's been really fun too. Nikki, you want to go?
Hi, I am Nikki Barnes. I am a TNT PhD student working on critical archiving and creative indigenous research methods. So ethics is kind of braided through all of that in really interrogating what the dominant narratives are and restoring the voices that have been marginalized from them.
My children are yelling in the background. Jose, do you want to introduce yourself too?
Yeah, I am Jose Vasquez. I'm the manager at the Office of Environment, Health and Safety here at UCF, and also have a profound interest in ethics. Okay, so, and I'm turning my camera off because I got people coming. I'm at work at the office, so people coming constantly to my office. So.
Thanks everybody, and thanks Jose for being here. Yeah, nobody should feel obligated to participate in any way that's not useful to them. I'm just really grateful to everybody for being here with us every 2 weeks. It's a really fun chance, and you can see just in this group the diversity of voices that come to the table. And for me, this has been a really important part of thinking about ethics. It's like there's only a limited subset of stuff that I know, and that's true for any of us. Dr. Kubler's subset is significantly different and bigger than mine, and mine's just different than his, and we've complemented each other well in leading this center together. So yeah, welcome everybody. I'm glad to be here. I shared 2 links to podcasts that I worked on with Ali earlier in the semester to get them going. And I realized that the second link stopped working at some point after I sent the notification. The email that I just sent this afternoon has an updated link, so you can look at that later if you didn't get a chance to listen to it and want to. The Online Ethics Center has shifted. It used to be at the National Academies of Engineering and it's now moved to Virginia Tech, and they're doing some web reorganization, and that's made all their links a mess. But you have the updated link now. So what we'll do is focus primarily on the Making the Call podcast. But generally what we want to do today is think together about COVID-19 vaccine ethics. There's a lot of really interesting and fruitful discussions around ethical implications of what's happening right now. The podcast that we'll talk through focuses on exemptions, but also I want to talk a little bit about changes to practice too. So how do we balance the individual against the community? Is even that the right distinction to be making? What personal values should we value and why? Why is it hard to tell someone they're wrong? To sort of say, no, the value perspective you're bringing to the table isn't going to be valued right now. And then what do conversations about health during a pandemic tell us about future conversations of health, if anything, right? What is this moment doing to our health practices? And I just want to open things up, but I wanted to say first, if you listen to this podcast, the first line completely distracted me because I swear that the person talking said, we will see kids with 104 beavers. And I was like, what would 104 beavers even look like? That's a lot of beavers. Like That's clearly not what she said, but that's what it, anyway, I got distracted after that. But let's talk about the context. The other thing to say, the other thing to say is that the two major voices in this podcast are Zeke Emanuel and Jonathan Moreno, who are really prominent national level bioethicists. Zeke Emanuel is the brother of Rahm Emanuel, the former mayor of Chicago. So they're both very high profile political figures. And Zeke Emanuel now is appointed to the 16-member COVID-19 task force under the Biden administration. And Moreno likewise has an incredibly long and prolific history as a bioethicist. So these are two very important, prominent voices in the bioethics community. Also, they come from this pretty particular traditional bioethics background. So we can unpack that a little bit too. But all right, where do you want to go from here? I can say things also, but. I see a hand. You could just like say things too. This is totally informal.
Okay. So when I was listening to this again, I thought it was interesting because it is recorded in like June of last year. And so I didn't have a ton of time to reflect on, is it playing out as I expected? Is it not? And it's an interesting thing to know that was in theoretical and now we're in actual. And I'm not sure the same concerns that I'm experiencing, the concerns that I thought I would be experiencing at this time.
I want to hear more, obviously. What are the concerns that you're experiencing now that you didn't think you were experiencing then?
So I think when the vaccine was a theory, it was scary because it was like, well, we don't know what it's going to be. We don't know how it's going to get to us, what the testing procedures are, what the rollout's going to look like, how that's going to do. And then when we started thinking about the rollout, I was like, well, this is going to be a chaotic nightmare about who gets it when and how are we going to prioritize that. And then it's been interesting in it actually happening, in that like different countries are doing it different ways too. So I don't remember if it was Israel, somewhere vaccinated their prisoners first. And I was like, whoa, that is not something that would fly in the US. But we are vaccinating our elderly or first. So there's some things too that come under protected legal standards with age and comorbidities and things like that, that it's interesting to then actually be living it. And so I think some of the things that I thought would be on the minds of everyone aren't, and there's other things instead. But then also for me, some of the things I thought would be on my mind are not there too. Like even being concerned about whether the vaccination is going to be safe and all of that. Like maybe that was something I was going to be concerned about before, but now I'm just like concerned about how I can get it and how I can ethically get it, because there's right now, and very immediately today, I have a bunch of friends being like, you can get the vaccine if you hang out at the sites afterwards. And I'm like, but that's like jumping the line. I'm not due for one. And like, is that okay? Or is that not okay? I mean, technically, yes, Sterling, go for it. Jump in.
I just want to adjunct to what you just said. It is, in my opinion, okay, it is okay, because once they go into that vial, if they don't have enough people to vaccinate, it goes in the garbage.
Right, and you're doing your part in some ways of trying to get that herd immunity down. At the same time, could they take that vial to the local grocery store and offer it around? I don't know.
There's a temperature situation and expiration, and it's really critical. I'm more concerned with how much goes in the garbage.
Okay,
That's
interesting.
in fact, I got my first vaccination. I was on a speed dial call. Stay up in the morning, and we'll call you if we run out of victims. And I 15 minutes, well, not even that, 10 minutes, boom, pulled in, got it done, and that was that.
As you're both talking, I'm thinking about this case from a couple of weeks ago, Dr. Gokul in Houston. Did you hear this? Remember this case? A physician lost his job. A Houston emergency physician lost his job because he was in the same position. He was vaccinating people. At the end of the day, he had, say, a dozen left, and he drove around the city to find people who fit the criteria and gave them vaccinations because he was worried about it. And then at the last minute, he had one left, and his wife, he couldn't find anybody else, and his wife, who fit all the criteria, he gave her the vaccine. And when they found out that the queue had been jumped or whatever, he hadn't followed protocol, he lost his job. And so it's weird, Ali, because as you're talking, I was thinking, I just signed up for a Facebook group here in Central Florida for vaccine hunters, I think it's called. And basically it's just a network of people who are like, oh, Publix has vaccines right now and they're going to throw them away, drive there. It's this whole crazy network and all of the Walmarts and Publix and all the vaccination centers in the state here will do that rather than throw them out. If they have leftover, they'll give them to you. But that's the same thing that this Houston physician did, but lost his job for.
I have a question that may add to the discussion about, you said that they just drive around to avoid them just throwing them away. But many of these vaccines require 2 doses. So how does that come into effect? Because now you need a second dose, even though you skipped your turn in line. So you may not be able to get that opportunity to get a second dose. Go ahead, Stern.
Well, if it works like I did, and it was very smooth. I don't know that all over the country it's smooth. No, you get a vaccination card. It tells you what the lot number was of the dose and everything, and it's like your new official voter's registration. And
Okay.
It was a little tricky to set up the appointment for the second dose, but and I had to drive. I live in Oviedo. I had to drive to the airport, and it was very quick once I got there. I mean, you almost drive up to get the dose, but a little tricky in getting scheduled. But I persisted, and I said, look, my second dose is going to expire. I'm supposed to get this Moderna thing within 28 days. And they responded and set me up with an appointment, and it was pretty good. Yeah, I had to travel a little bit, but it worked.
Yeah, that would be my only concern. If jumping the line that's not really a big deal because we're avoiding waste, which that's overall a good thing. But my only concern would be that just people getting picky over the second dose.
Well, in Joshua, here's a point where the technical knowledge is lacking, and maybe Sterling, you can weigh in too. But there's something to be said. There's an immunity that's built even with the first dose, right? So there's nothing necessarily wrong with missing the second dose, even if you then get vaccinated in line later on. You're still helping on this first level herd immunity, avoiding waste. So it's even if the people who skip the line in this way to pick up these otherwise wasted doses don't get a second shot, they're still helping with this public health mission.
Yeah.
Dr. Kubler, yeah.
I either have an interesting observation or I'm conflating 2 disparate issues. So the idea seems to be, which I kind of agree with a lot, is that we don't want to waste so we can justify maybe an apparent skipping of the line. Maybe the same rationale is used or is not being used enough with the issue of HeLa cells. So there's objection to HeLa cells being used in cancer therapy. And the justification is, well, we're curing people, but the ethical conundrum there is that they were harvested and used without a person's approval. So, in which ethical situations are we able to way and say, well, we're avoiding waste or harms. It seems like it's a utilitarian argument. And I just wonder what's on the scales that makes people get animated about using the knowledge of HeLa cells, even though it's done and gone. We can't go find Henrietta Lacks and ask for her permission. And yet here we can excuse jumping the line. And then the second question is, well, when we allow and look the other way with a lot of jumping the line, are we basically creating an out for people not to get animated and objecting about poor distribution systems that benefit us when there's the opportunity to now jump line because there's waste?
So I have a very utilitarian worldview. But I think one thing that people miss when they do cost benefit analysis of things like this line jumping, they look at, do the ends justify the means? But I don't think everyone has a fair evaluation of what the ends are, because people might see the ends as simply where we're closer to herd immunity, we wasted less vaccine. But the ends are actually, you're closer to herd immunity, and you're also creating a world where it's okay to jump the line in this scenario. And now you have new lines you have to draw. When is it not okay? And I think a lot of people don't see past the ends now versus what that does to our perception of what's okay and what isn't okay. And now that being said, I think I'm of the opinion that with that involved, that the ends probably do justify the means still. And that might just be because of how strongly I pull towards the utilitarian argument. However, I think that's worth consideration, that when you're in like a sort of world crisis, what are you making acceptable that now we might have to rethink in future world crises?
Yeah, that's good, Austin. Thank you. And that sounds very familiar. That's a perspective that the first panelist in this OEC podcast brings up as well, talking about like when we're using a cost benefit analysis, like what's being considered best for whom, how do we quantify harms, those perspectives. Austin, I saw somebody's hand. Sean, Sean's hand. Hi, Sean.
Hi. Bouncing off of that, I think that the utilitarian arguments that we're discussing do gain a lot of traction and weight, especially in I mean, I don't even have a reference point for this, but in this event of mass death, something we've never seen on this scale in this way in modern times, that utilitarian argument becomes perhaps more valuable in a way, and more people ascribe to it. But also what you said, Dr. Kugler, about almost like a lessening of the clamor or the call for a better distribution system. I think I definitely see that, but there's some balance there where it's, you want to push for the best and most ethical and most efficient method of distribution. But then once you get to the point of, okay, this is the distribution system being used in this moment, then there is also, I think, an ethical imperative to utilize that extra that does fall off the sides of the wagon on the way. And I guess that's a interesting way of putting that, but yeah.
Very Oregon Trail of you. Sterling, yeah.
Well, I've got two things I want to add, but so, yeah, I really didn't feel like I was jumping the line by being, well, plus I'm a healthcare worker. I was supposed to be like next in line anyway, but by being there that day, but probably jumped the line for the second dose. And this is all in actuality, because once I got the first dose, then likely, I mean, obviously that affected the distribution of the second dose. And I didn't really feel like I jumped the line for the first dose, but I did get in there for the second one. And I mean, that's the actual thing. But what I wanted to ask, since we're talking about utilitarianism and Dr. Beaver, so Peter Singer, he would probably, I mean, he's still alive, right? I would imagine he's not too keen on vaccinating the elderly, because a lot of what he has said was push him off the cliff. I mean, not to that extreme, but I mean, he has a very don't, from everything I've read, he's got a very strong opinion about whether, you know, super herd immunity, you know, I mean, so, you know, the strongest survive actually, you know, and not to preserve welfare. And so a couple of guys mentioned the utilitarian argument. So I was just wondering, that's kind of an extreme utilitarian argument, but I was just wondering what Peter Singer would be thinking about, although he was old enough to get the first dose, to be first in line. But anyway, I was just wondering what you would think about based on what some of the stuff that he's written.
Dr. Kerr.
Yeah, I think that's interesting that you bring in these other arguments. And I think too, just returning to the podcast and what I was trying to say, like what I was saying too about it's so different. Like the podcast is literally talking about what if people won't vaccinate? And now we're like, how do we ethically get to herd immunity? Like, and what is it? And then that's one of my first thoughts. But then the other thing is that, like, let's be honest. Like, if I have to be honest with myself too, like, I'm justifying this desire to jump the line with being like, well, here are the reasons why it's actually an okay thing, versus also just acknowledging that, like, I'd like to have some vaccinated immunity. Like, I'd like to be safer, you know, and I'd like those around me to be safer. So because as Dr. Kubler was saying, like, we could, or maybe that was Sean's interpretation, but we could change the system. I mean, is there not a better system to get those remaining doses out to the next in the designated line? And then Sterling, I think you're also questioning, but is the line flawed? Like, is the line the most ethical way of being? So if I was a healthcare worker, would this be a different day for me? Of course it would. If the policy here said education included anybody in an academic environment, different game. It's not. So we're trying to balance everything. And I'm not sure in my mind I'm even having a utilitarian question as much as maybe some other questions are coming up for me.
Dominique, go ahead.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so listening, I feel like I'm having almost the opposite type of questions in regards to this. Only because, you know, for me, it's more like a competition between science and history. So for African Americans, you know, with regards to, you know, medical treatments and vaccines and things like that, we haven't had the best history in regards to, you know, how we've been utilized as well as how we've been protected. So I remember when vaccines were first being talked about, you know, it was a situation where I think early last year, there were, I think, some French science doctors were talking about testing vaccines on African children or people from Africa. And I was like, of course, that causes a pause. But then now you're seeing a situation where it's a constant battle between, and I've noticed even in the trends of seeing who's being vaccinated, especially with the African American population being one of the least vaccinated, it's a combination of one, the infrastructure, but then also two, it's hesitation due to mistrust or other things. So, you know, I actually am having the opposite effect, whereas, you know, I'm not rushing the gates to try to get vaccine. You know, when it happens, it will, but I'm not one of the ones on the front line trying to say, hey, as soon as possible, because there is that mistrust almost.
Yeah, that's good, Dominique. And Nikki just posted a really important piece. I don't know the Axios piece, but I've heard this argument too, this data, that federal regulators have done a pretty good job of advertising the vaccine in the right ways. So hesitancy is falling among African Americans, but rising among some other groups for political reasons, especially white, right-leaning Americans of middle age hesitancy is going up. So yeah, we live in this really complicated landscape, and that's partly why I liked listening to this podcast, because Allie's right. Like, it's pretty dated, and yet the questions they're asking are very much the same. It's interesting to think about the answers that we know now to those questions. Everything from, hesitancy and vaccine rates, but also to efficacy. Because one of the things that the podcasters were saying was, if we had a vaccine that was 60% efficacious, the take-up wouldn't be so great. But imagine if it's 90%, and it was, right? So people could get on TV and say, yes, we're on board, we're taking this vaccine in public, we're doing it. And that kind of ramped up rates, perhaps. Austin, go ahead.
Yeah, hopefully my audio quality will be okay here, because I'm kind of in an area driving right now where I don't have the best signal. But to kind of go off something that I think Allison said was about how this isn't what we were expecting to see, about, everyone clamoring to get the vaccine versus, how do we get people to take the vaccine? I think this is kind of a two-tiered issue, though. I think once there is X percentage of the population that really wants the vaccine, but there's also Y percentage of the population that's hesitant. And I don't know exactly what the percentage we need to get to herd immunity is. And if that percentage is greater than X, then how do you get the rest of Y to cooperate? I think that there really is a problem there, potentially, and maybe we just haven't gotten to it yet, because our supply doesn't exceed the demand yet when it comes to vaccines. But there is the back half of that supply demand curve, and do we think we'll run into problems there?
Yeah, that's well said, Austin. This was the other piece I really liked about this podcast, is because towards the end, what they're talking about is when and how to draw the line around mandatory vaccination policies. So just to make sure the distinctions are clear, they distinguish between compulsory vaccines and mandatory vaccines, and they say compulsory vaccination has very seldom happened. They give that case of Jacobson versus Massachusetts in 1905. There was a polio outbreak or something in Massachusetts, and a Lutheran minister refused to either pay the fine or get vaccinated, so against the law. And it went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no, this is a case where we can force you to get a vaccine. It's important enough to public health. And so person then either had to get the vaccine or pay the fine. But that was the one instance they mentioned of compulsory vaccination. But the discussion in the podcast was around mandatory vaccination. And Dr. Kerr, you mentioned in the chat about they had these discussions around whether or not the current exemption landscape, which includes philosophical, personal, and religious exemptions alongside medical exemptions, is too broad. And the argument that was offered by Emmanuel, I think, in this piece, was that medical exemption should be the only type of exemptions allowed. And that's general. That's not necessarily just about COVID-19. That's saying there are no such things as relevant religious or personal or philosophical exemptions. Medical exemptions are the only ones that should count.
Well, in the spring, Dr. Beaver, I think I told you that I was resistant to getting the vaccine altogether. I mean, I'm not an anti-vaxxer, but I wanted to see it played out in longer trials. I work in a laboratory, and it usually takes forever years to get something like this up. So I was resistant, but it may not be legally compulsory, but it pretty much is. I mean, I've got flights that won't let you can't travel around the country. The seminar at Duke University, don't come if you got to have your vaccine card if you show up, before you show up. So really, to participate in things or to live, it's pretty much spelled out there that you got to have this, eventually. So.
Well, and Dr. Curry, you could weigh in here because I'm not sure I remember all the details exactly, but somebody towards the end of the podcast brought up this example of the hospital as a microcosm of society. And because the question was how do you administer vaccines to people who are resistant? And the answer was, well, we do it in the hospital. We just say, our job is to protect patients. So if you want to participate in this, you have to be vaccinated. Otherwise, you lose your job. You have a two-week paid leave, I think, and then you lose your job. And so I think, Sterling, your other examples are the same deal. Like there are values that we share that override your personal religious concerns, and that if you want to participate in this community with this particular value set, the vaccine is the way to go. Otherwise, you can't.
Exactly.
And it's a really interesting view. It makes me wonder under what conditions one value can take priority over another value, because again, any public space, there's this hesitancy to call anybody out for having in this case, like a value that is going to put public health at risk, because we want to protect so much individual values. And that's why we have things like religious exemptions.
Doesn't it mimic the parents that don't want their children to be vaccinated in public schools? That it's the same sort of situation, right?
Yeah, same sort of situation, right? If by that you mean, as I understand it, in order for children to be in public schools, they need to be vaccinated.
Right, right. And there's parents that they call them the anti-vaxxers, right? That say, no, I'm not going to do this, and then there's conflict there between.
Yeah. Just to stick on this a minute, because the other bit from the podcast that I really liked was the Talmudic example. So they had a rabbi on the podcast talking through this issue, and basically arguing that some Jewish communities don't want to argue for or support a mandatory vaccination policy, but also that there's no such thing under Jewish law, Talmudic law, as religious exemptions, right? The idea is that there's only medical exemptions. They gave this example of a Talmudic piece of circumcision, right? And the example was something like, if you circumcise your first child and it dies, and you circumcise your second child and you dies, the Talmudic law says, don't circumcise your third child. And it's not although it's encoded in religious doctrine, it's not a religious exemption. It's a straight up medical exemption. Like, you've killed 2 children, like, don't do that again, right? Mm-hmm. And so religious practices encode medical exemptions. And that's the argument from this particular rabbi, that in that case, and then the bioethicists push this a little bit, and they say they can't think of a single religious tradition, with the exception of Christian Science, that actually has encoded a religious reason for not getting a vaccine. Every other major religion encodes practices of caring for your community, so would be pro-vaccination.
Well, okay, so I'm gonna jump in and,
please.
Throw some arguments around just to play with it. But I thought that was very interesting, and I thought the podcast was very much dominated by the bioethicists, right? And the final guest, who was very adamant, like, it's about science, and once we stop like talking about that, like it's so, and he's does vaccinations for children, works in that, and he was the one with the when you're working in a hospital unit, if you're going to work in that hospital unit, you protect the people. So it was interesting though, because you could tell that this was his belief system, and it was his value of science and his value of, this is how you protect others, and this is the reason behind vaccinations. So that was interesting, because I was like, you do understand that other people value religion over science, or they value their belief, their personal experience over anything somebody else is telling them. So it was just interesting that he was so convinced of his own argument, because it was through his lens. But the other thing that was interesting is they really did want to shoot down this religious on the base of like facts and history, without accounting for, okay, vaccines were not around at the origin of many of these religions. Like, so what, and not to get into a big, huge religious history debate, because I am not qualified, but if I think about it, a lot of religion is being able to have faith or control in that which is unknown and uncontrollable. So same with science, right? Like, some of us are compelled to do science or compelled to study history. in effort to better understand our world and to increase our confidence in that. So it's just interesting to the juxtaposition of he was so like, it's science and anything beyond that is just stupid. And like, I can show you the facts and figures. And I'm like, yeah, but that you're not speaking as a religious person, or you're not speaking as a parent who's lost 2 children or had 4 children have difficulties that emerged around the time of their vaccinations. Like it's people are trying to make sense of their worlds, and they're going to what their beliefs are to make sense of that. So I think that's really why it's such a hard question of, can we make it mandatory? Well, we're making it mandatory on some set of beliefs.
Yeah, that's well said. I don't want to get
So-
into anything and say that's something we'll talk about next week. We're inviting a guest in to talk about epistemology and epistemic trespassing, and like what counts as knowledge. So it's questions of like power and knowledge are embedded in this discussion too. Austin, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, so I just want to mention, I think there's a lot of pragmatic value in sort of offering an olive branch to these communities that might have belief systems that are antithetical to vaccination. Because I don't want to get too into anything religious or political either. However, existing in a society, there are a lot of belief systems that have had to adapt from their roots to conform and participate in the society as a whole. You know, this isn't something new, that belief systems have somewhat altered into what's acceptable and what's not within the system, because they do have to line up with what's acceptable in society as well. And I don't know how read on the potential, sources of this virus people are, but a lot of people talk about it happening once every century. Some of the things I've read indicate that we're beginning to live in a world where situations like this, health crises like this, could be more prevalent than once a century. And I think there's a lot of value in going forward, trying to kind of bridge the gap between the differences in these communities and what might need to happen, like I said, in a utilitarian sense before, about how can you get these people to rationalize the need for herd immunity and get it to, you can't tell them it doesn't disagree with their religion, but you kind of have to get them to, I don't want to say you have to get them to be okay with it, but I think a best effort needs to be made to convince them in a way that doesn't step on toes, as opposed to just telling them you're wrong because of science.
Yeah, thanks, Austin. That's well said. Dr. Gilbert, go ahead.
I hear what Austin is saying, and I agree with the thrust in many ways, that a lot can be learned from this whole experience about communication and how we communicate, medical issues, scientific issues, and whatnot, that there's a whole marketing associated with it. But I think in some ways that's decoupled maybe from the more essential issue of the competition between societal values versus individual values. And the question is, where is an individual value to declare, I don't want to participate, I don't want to vaccinate, whether it be on religious grounds or not? Where is that perhaps trumped by a community value? And what is the nature of that community value? So there seems to be a lot of leveraging of the notion that it's a community value because, well, the science is obvious, everyone agrees, the vaccine helps. And it does. I mean, as a scientist myself, I think you look at the data and it's incontrovertible. Though I will tell you, I've met many people who will look at the same data, polio data, and swear up and down that the data are in fact debatable. So that's also a separate issue, right? People can look at the same facts and come to radically different views on what those facts tell you. But I think there's this a priori assumption that the science is there and everyone is going to agree that the community shares that value. And I don't think that's true at all. I think a lot of people have a very strong conviction that they should be able to determine for themselves what happens. And I don't know if that's just because they're belligerent, or if it's because in some ways we've been raised, at least in this society, or conditioned to believe that individual control is very important, because there have been so many blatant examples in the past, not related to healthcare issues, where community control or community movement has had very bad outcomes. And so we think there needs to be this balance then between almost authoritarian, oligarchical community direction trumping the individual. And so I have trouble in my own mind of decoupling the cultural issues, the communication issues, and whether there's some fundamental value competition there apart from enculturation and where we grew up, that needs to be addressed.
Just to add in, just to go big picture for a second, the conversations we've been having in the last few minutes about the relationship between ethical theories, we spent some time on utilitarianism, communication, power dynamics, personal values and beliefs. Like that's the messiness that I think Dr. Kubler is talking through. And this is why these discussions around ethics are so important, because even if you're Peter Singer, right, and we're using Singer here as an example of a strict utilitarian, other factors play into the ways in which he makes decisions, just like they do for all of us. So it's a really messy landscape, and the tools of normative theory can help, but they're not going to be sufficient alone. And this is Dr. Kerr's point too about the relationship between ethical decision-making and other strategies. And just to read, Ali, something you wrote in the post in response to Dr. Kubler, you said, it goes further because it's not just a one versus many issue. It can be a one versus a few, or versus a many, or versus many more. So the things we're pitting against each other, even in a utilitarian calculus, are so varied that it makes for a really mess, a really mess. That's not a term. A big mess. It makes for something very messy. I'm going to be quiet.
Okay, don't take this lightly. It's not meant to be okay. Take it as ever, whatever you need it as. I was wondering, because of when this came out too, it just rolls into my head. What if we were talking about toilet paper instead of vaccinations? And it's having me really like question a lot of what, sort of, not to throw it out blankly, but like a privileged thing in that too, of the question is like, can I jump the line to get the vaccination? Not how do I determine whether it's even safe to give to my kids? And the same thing kind of with toilet paper, like we did have to limit the amount of toilet paper or cleaning products that could happen until we got enough back in, and then everything. And I don't know, I mean, I wasn't ever a hoarder of toilet paper, but that's probably because I didn't have that option. Like by the time I got to the party, it wasn't an option. So I don't know what I personally would have done about that. But so I'm not trying to make light of it by comparing the vaccination to toilet paper is what I wanted to clarify. But when I think about it that way, it draws some really interesting questions that have me being like, ooh, if we're talking about toilet paper, what would people justify versus when we're talking about a vaccination?
Sterling said, imagine if it had been a gastrointestinal virus. Yeah, that's grosser, but yes.
Well, I mean,
the questions are the same, Ali, right? Because I could think like, even what would it mean to think about mandatory consumption policies or purchasing policies around vaccines? Like, but we did this, right? It's many stores, private entities would say, no, you can only buy 1 4-pack of toilet paper at a time, because they'd seen the people go in with their like 4 shopping carts and buy all of the toilet paper. And so there were those sort of mandatory limits put in place. So in some ways, like, I think the argument, I don't know, I think I'm more sympathetic to the argument than perhaps I should be, which is interesting.
To which argument specifically are you more sympathetic? Sorry, Allison.
No. I'm the more sympathetic to sort of the orientation of the podcast, which is the science tells us mandatory vaccines are the way to go. We should only focus on medical exemptions. That thing, that argument. Dr.
Allison, what were you going to say? I'm sorry, I interrupted.
Oh, I thought he was saying that sympathetic to the comparison with toilet paper. I really didn't want it to come across as like, think of vaccines like toilet paper. It's not that, but it's the same idea. We were in a pandemic situation and people justified camping out for toilet paper and things like that. And there was less of an argument about, I'm getting my toilet paper because everybody else around me deserves the right for me to be clean. Like it became like I've got to have this to survive kind of thing.
Yeah, completely inappropriately, I was thinking like the Talmudic example doesn't really hold up with toilet paper, but yeah, I see the analogy. Yeah, that's good. Austin, you say more broadly, there's a history of the few needing to yield to the needs and preferences of the many to participate in a functioning society. Yeah, we could probably unpack that, but I think that's, at least in the very least, that seems to be the tension that democracies writ large are built around, right? The idea that we are built around the idea of individual choice and liberty to the limit of when it interferes with the needs or the benefits of the many. Yeah. Until my liberties get in the way of your liberties, and then we have a problem. And vaccine policies are just that sort of thing. And maybe toilet paper is, to continue with the analogy too. Ellie, when you're thinking through that analogy, are you thinking like that's another reason to think that the argument has been overstated on the case of the bioethicist?
No, I think the opposite is that when I think back about what a pandemic, a different situation yielded in all the communities around toilet paper alone, then you think about something as arguably way more important than toilet paper, and what that could bring up when toilet paper alone was causing people to justify a whole lot of things that one would not ever anticipate with regards to toilet paper or cleaning supplies. So the analogy came up when I forget who mentioned it, but said something about the supply and demand. So right now the supply is limited on the vaccine, and someday it won't be, right? But right now we're in the scarcity of toilet paper stage, which is yielding some very justifiable questions and concerns and debates and challenges. Yes, Lakeland, thanks.
No, I think that I like where you're going, that analogy. The only hole I see in that is to me, the analogies aren't necessarily like line to line, right? Because like with the toilet paper thing, it's not that it's being metered out, but there's excess that it's going to get thrown out, unless, if people don't use it. It's almost a reverse situation where it's like people are taking too much of it. And so I wonder, like, to take that analogy further, I wonder like what questions we would be asking if it were, okay, yes, you can only have, one package of toilet paper per family that comes through, whatever. But then it was like, oh, but if there's a whole aisle of toilet paper left over at the end of the day, we're just going to toss it. Like that's like, that to me is a better working, right? And like that addresses some of the questions that we were bringing up at the beginning. But then I kind of want to say also, like, we're applying ethical quandaries and like and throwing like these ethical ideas around about almost like a black and white situation where it's like, okay, you either jump the line and are maybe unethical, or you don't jump the line and like they throw out vaccines. And so like, what do you do? But for me, I feel like nothing's ever that black and white, and there's always like a third. Like, why can't there be a third option here? Like, why can't there be like another thing that we can consider doing that is a merging of both, right? So like, I think in my mind of that train example where it's like, you're driving a train and you're gonna hit one person or 5 people. What's better? you know, it's like, well, why do I have to choose between one of those? Right? Like, why isn't there a third option? Why isn't there the option of like, I stop driving the train and I push the one person out of the way? I might get hit, but like, why isn't that an option? You know, and so like, I wonder here, could there be a third, fourth, fifth thing that we grapple with to try and make a seemingly ethical conundrum like a little less conundrumy, if that makes sense? I don't know.
I have something to say bouncing off of the kind of third option scenario. Would we be, if there were more of a system in place for what you do with these, let's say excess doses at the end of the day, even if that system was decided somewhat arbitrarily, if it had been decided ahead of time and more with a little bit more structure, even if it were equally as arbitrary, would we stigmatize it the same way that we might be doing so now?
Yeah, that's a good question, Austin.
So this is Shaner, and I heard something yesterday, and I don't know whether it's accurate or not. I haven't had like I haven't objectively looked into it, but somebody mentioned to me that Publix has been given vaccinations for COVID now. And Governor DeSantis said that people under 65 who have underlying conditions are eligible. But Publix made an announcement that they were not going to be requiring physician note. And so that was a bit surprising to me, because, we have heard all these stories where people have dressed up as an elderly and gone and gotten shots and whatnot. And so I was thinking that was quite irresponsible of Publix to kind of disregard that requirement and say, we're just going to do an honor system and whoever shows up, and asserts that they have an underlying condition that they would get the vaccination. So I don't know if anybody else has heard that and what your thoughts are about that.
Thanks, Shaynor. Yeah, I'd heard the same thing, and also coupled to a couple other news stories. One, that Publix is one of the sites that are giving out doses to whoever. If they're going to throw them out at the end of the day, you just show up and ask if there's any left over. You could get a shot. And then second, that there have been some feelings of guilt by some people who meet underlying conditions, especially BMI conditions, for going to get vaccines, even though they're in the queue, they've got a underlying medical condition, but maybe otherwise are perfectly healthy and staying at home, and there could be other people more at risk. They're saying, well, I fit the conditions, so I'm going to go and get one because my BMI is over 30, and therefore I can legally do so. So yeah, it's again, we're circling around sort of the same subset of issues: who's getting the vaccines and why. And just to situate this in the context of this podcast, these are questions that are beyond the scope of questions we were asking functionally a year ago when this podcast was written, directed. So it's interesting that the landscape of ethical issues continues to emerge even on this one issue of COVID-19 vaccines. And it changes notably because of the science, or at least the data that we're getting. It changes because of what we know about the vaccines, but also in conjunction with that, public opinion around the vaccines. So this landscape is now shifting our ethical conversations in really important ways. I know, friends, we are over time now, so I wanted to thank everybody for being here and having this discussion with us. In 2 weeks, my friend Mark Sata, Dr. Mark Sata, is going to talk with us about epistemic trespassing. So we'll do a lot of sort of power and knowledge questions with him. So you should bring your questions about how we know and why we know and who knows to Dr. Sata in 2 weeks. In the meantime, do well, be better, and stay safe. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was nice meeting y'all.